Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello, thank you all for joining us today. We have a great panel assembled to discuss recent work about the meaning of honesty, and we're, of course, very happy to have all of you here with us. A note about the project that this sits under. So our team is currently in the process of conducting a systematic review. And in the process of our discussions, we developed this conceptual framework that we thought would be interesting to share, and we could have a fruitful discussion. So we kind of designed this roundtable, Elizabeth and I together, of course, with the support of our collaborators. Our plan for today is for me to first kind of go over what this conceptual framework is, go over what the facets that make it up are, before we hand it off to our panelists. They will each present their work as it relates at least primarily to one of these facets before we bring everything together and have our Q&A section. A quick note about questions. We've scheduled a significant amount of time at the end to have like a fruitful Q&A, so we ask that you keep your questions until that part. Of course, please feel free to type your messages in chat, questions in chat, I should say, and we will do our best to kind of identify common themes and incorporate them in the Q&A. So with that, a quick preamble. Of course, I'm sure we can all agree that honesty is important, especially in situations where disagreements emerge. Honesty is often a factor that dominates thoughts, motivations, and behaviors. Individuals are very concerned with how honest they are perceived to be and how honestly others treat them. And we often teach in conflict and negotiation that honesty is often the best policy, right? Because it is almost a prerequisite that allows us to have this open discussion and get at the major issues that could hopefully, ideally, lead us to more optimal kind of integrative solutions. At the same time, we're also aware that there are situations in which it is beneficial for at least certain individuals in this context to be less than honest, if not outright dishonest, right? These involve things, behaviors like avoiding full disclosure, keeping some information hidden as it benefits certain individuals. What is interesting and was interesting for our team was that when viewing what is considered honest behaviors in these different situations, we noticed that changes, right? Which for us was very informative because in our discussions, we reasoned that by examining what is considered honest behaviors in different situations and how these kind of the differing conceptions of honest behaviors are related to one another, we can then, by kind of taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture, we can get a better understanding for kind of the overall concept of honesty as a larger construct. So that is what we tried to do. Our starting point, and one we all often default to when we think about honest behavior, is one that was put by Emma and Taya, which is honesty is speaking in accordance with one's own beliefs, thoughts, and feelings, right? For us was a great starting point. But in our discussions, we wondered if there were some other ways in which that go beyond what someone says to be truthful or is lying, right? So a couple of the examples that came up early on in our discussions were things about students cheating on exams or athletes taking performance-enhancing drugs, right? Well, obviously this is cheating. What we reasoned was that by doing these behaviors, individuals are communicating certain information about themselves that is wrong, right? Which for us was again not accountable, but previous definitions focus about verbal expression. So we expanded this definition to include acts of communication, which cover both verbal and non-verbal expressions. We refer to this facet as belief speaking, and this was our first facet that emerged. And now here, when we get to the panelists, Maurice will talk about the wide range of possible communication that fall at least primarily under this facet of belief speaking. Now, during our discussions about the meaning of honesty, we wondered what are some of the other ways in which someone could be less than honest, again, beyond telling the truth or lying. You know, fortunately and unfortunately, the political discourse in the US has a lot of examples in recent years about individuals making statements that at least initially seems to be what they think seems to be truthful, but of course, fact-checking proves false, right? Judging such behaviors under the distinction of whether or not someone says what they believe to be true risks, at least initially, this person being labeled as honest, and we argued that this is insufficient. So we created our second facet, which we refer to as truth seeking, which we define as a reasonable effort on the part of the communicator to confirm their beliefs, and if their beliefs are proven false, correct them. This is a two-part process, right? And we argue that failure on each could mean the person is viewed less honestly or even outright dishonestly. Now, this distinction is helpful, this distinction of truth-seeking from belief-speaking, I should say, in helping us understand why things like willful ignorance, motivated reasoning, self-deceptions could be perceived as deviation from honesty. Here, Daniel will discuss what are some of the barriers that get in the way of individuals conducting sufficient truth-seeking. And finally, our third facet was one that emerged in our discussions based on two main points. The first being our view of honest behavior as an act of communication, right? An act of communication naturally involves a communicator and a target or targets, meaning that there is an aspect that impacts the target. There is a social aspect to this behavior. And the other point that led us down this way was recent work in the negotiation literature about paltering, which is the use of truthful statement to create a misleading impression, right? Again, judging such behaviors as whether or not someone is truthful is not necessarily adequate because there is an intention to mislead someone else. So the third facet that we conceptualized was fostering understanding, and we note in true beliefs, that is the optimal end of that facet, and involves efforts on the part of the communicator to ensure that their beliefs that are communicated are understood by the target. And this involves behaviors, for example, like asking if clarifications are needed, ensuring that the target has access to additional information that may be needed to understand or process the message and integrate it. Now, this facet, again, is helpful, disentangling this from the others in helping us understand why communicating what one believes to be true without conducting these efforts could be viewed as less than honest, right? So this, again, touches on things like helps us explain why paltering is a deviation from honesty, but also things like deflecting questions or alternatively truth bombs, right? Saying a truthful statement, but then leaving it without trying to do any kind of efforts at fostering understanding could be viewed as less than fully honest. Now, given the complexity of this facet, we've dedicated a bit more time for it in our panel section, and we have two panelists line up. So first, Julia will discuss what some of the considerations are in increasing receptiveness in situations in which honesty could be difficult, such as when there are opposing views. And Juliana will present her work on how we can handle disagreements and increase connections between people through constructive feedback. Combined, this is our conceptual framework. We've come to refer to the overlap of all three facets as capital H honesty. And as I mentioned, we're currently in the process of a systematic review in the organizational literature over the last several decades and using this as our guiding framework, but we hope we can have an interesting discussion today based on it. And I would also say that for structural reasons, we've organized the roundtable such that each of our panelists reflect on their work as it primarily relates to one of these facets. But certainly, and as probably alluded to and has occurred to many of you, there are very interesting questions that emerge in the overlaps between these facets, and one that we hope in future years will help other researchers do work that kind of expands the scope of what is considered honest. So that is what I have for the intro. Before I hand it over to our panelists, we wanted to take a few minutes to have you all respond to 5 quick questions that we'll circle back to later. So if we can, and I'll time us, I'll start a quick poll. If you can all respond to it, of course, anonymously, that'll be helpful. Thank you.
Benny, I'm not able to do it because I think you closed it for me earlier, but are other people able to answer other questions?
I reopened it.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. I think it's just me then, because I was only in the session. I was the only one in the session.
I think the co-host can't do it.
Yeah, I can't do it either.
Oh, I see. I can't do it either. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a way to allow the co-host to do it, Benny?
I'm a co-host, so that's why I think I can do it. I don't know.
Yeah. So
Okay.
probably not. All right.
Well,
So
Just
Mention
rely on
your
the
response.
audience then.
well, yes. Well, good thing we have some non-hosts and co-hosts here.
Yeah, I am not seeing any responses, so I'm not sure if it's working correctly, but I hope so.
yeah, we'll probably when people submit it. So
I hope so.
The questions require some thinking. I'm
Yeah.
having a hard time filling it out quickly.
yeah, we're going
That's
to
why.
overload you
Take a
with
couple of minutes.
information and then give you a pop quiz. And then we'll see if you cheat on the test. No, just kidding.
I knew there was an exam in this session. I wouldn't have signed up.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, right. You thought when you went emeritus, you didn't have to get these tests anymore, but little did you know.
Roy, it's curved. It's going to be okay.
Okay, thank you. Don't fail me. Don't fail me.
So while we're doing this, is it Maurice is our next presenter?
Yes.
All right. And Maurice, I think if you share your screen, the poll will still stay up. So if you want to
Okay.
do that while people are considering these questions.
I'll even say they were hard, even though I've been thinking about this for a year. Those were hard
Yeah,
questions.
I think it's been more than a year now. We've been.
Yeah.
Taya, is that working?
I hit escape and the quiz disappeared. So let's see if I can get it back. No.
We'll come back to it later. I think it's more for our
Fine, I'm doing
discussion. So
it again, but I somehow it disappeared when I hit a when you flip your screen. So it's okay.
Oh, did
I thought it would stay up.
No, I don't know. Maybe
my screen
No,
share?
it's good. It works. It works. Still works fine.
So
No
it's-
problem.
I wonder if you click polls, but do people want more time, or should we turn the floor over to Maurice? Turn the floor over to Maurice. Thank you, Charlie, for the thumbs up. Enough. Good. All
Yeah.
right. Lots of thumbs up. Very good, positive, big feedback. Thank you. All right, Maurice, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. And I think I'm sharing my screen. Is that all right? I
Yes.
appreciate the. And somehow I would have thought a year and a half in we wouldn't need all that confirmation, but it's amazing to be here with all of you. Thanks for joining us. I was sort of similarly excited to be part of this panel. Before I actually knew exactly what belief speaking was, I was happy to talk about it just because I thought the honesty was such an interesting topic. And I think sort of constant with the rest of the team on this panel, there's so many great experts here, and I feel like their work really speaks to these issues perhaps more directly and more articulately than mine. But I'll share some of the ideas that I've been thinking about. And I think a lot of this idea about belief speaking really comes close to Emma's work. And several years ago, Emma and I were working on some ideas related to pro-social lying and thinking about the ways in which people value honesty versus kindness. And so when you tell somebody that the scan looks better than it really does, or you tell somebody that they look great after a bad haircut, those could be dishonest statements that people really appreciate and value. And so sometimes belief speaking or sort of saying what is completely honest may not be the kindest or even moral thing to do. So some of that work is really sort of motivated for me sort of thinking about, what is honesty? Is that always what we want? And then the world is so complicated around honesty. It's made me think, I think, sort of hard about how we might get to some shared understanding of reality. And I'll share just a couple of slides to touch on some of the work that I've been doing. One stream of work has looked at the kinds of responses that we give to questions that we get. And this is quite common in negotiations, but in any social exchange, people are seeking information. And you can think about, what kind of response we might give to a difficult question. And whether it's an interview or negotiation or something else, we're often asked sometimes very difficult questions, like, are you planning to have kids? And you can think about a full and honest response, like, yes, we are currently trying to have kids. So that could be the full disclosure, or somebody asks, how much money do you make in your last position? You could give a full and honest response. But we can think about how entitled people are to that information. And we can also think about the disadvantage you might put yourself in should you disclose it. And so you can also think about just declining to answer. So I'd rather not answer that question, which creates some friction. That is, we have these social norms where if somebody asks a question, we feel compelled or expected to answer it. And in some work with Inav and Eric Van Epps, we've looked at people's willingness to answer just crazy questions, so very personal questions. People seem quite willing to answer them. So if you ask people how much money they make, you'll be surprised at how often you'll get a response. The sort of the classic type of deception is this lie by commission. I think if we were to sort of go back a decade or two, we would think of this as the classic lie, which is somebody just misstates the truth. And so I think that's the sort of this reference, this lie by commission, something that's clearly untrue. But I think some more recent work has really sort of pointed to some interesting alternatives to lies by commission. We've also thought about lies by omission, just letting people believe through inaction the wrong things. But they're active things that I think fall somewhere between a lie of commission and a lie of omission. Paltering, I really quite like this idea of using truthful statements to mislead other people. So we're saying sentences that are factually true, but that convey the wrong impression. And so it's active, it's like a lie of commission, but the statement itself is factually true. And what's so fun about paltering is that we can really have very divergent perceptions of the ethicality of that act. So I might palter when I'm having a conversation with Benny, and I go home at night saying, look, I only said truthful things. I was honest because every statement was true. But Benny's like, oh, that was completely misleading. He created an impression that was totally wrong. And he might feel very misled. So there's paltering. Dodging is another stream of work that I became interested in, and some work with Brad Bitterly, where what's fun about dodging is we're both invoking and violating this Gricean norm of questions. We're invoking it by asking another question in response to a question. So we feel compelled to answer questions, but here we're just answering a question with a question. Oh, I'm sorry, that's deflection. I'm sorry, I meant to talk about deflection. So this idea of deflection is responding to a question with a question. We're both sort of invoking and violating this Gricean norm, which seems to be very effective in redirecting conversations. And I'll show you on the next slide the idea that when we deflect, we're very likely to redirect a conversation. And if we think about the onus or the responsibility conversational partners have for not getting to the bottom of something, if I think about it as a shared responsibility, deflection really helps put more of the onus of responsibility for not getting to the bottom of something on the conversational partner. And then this dodge is sort of answering a different question. Politicians do this quite a lot. They're asked one question and then they sort of dodge with a very different one. Okay, so those are some ideas about responses. I'll show you just one slide from some work where we had people go through a conversation. They had been misled with either live commission, a palter, or deflection. And then they were asked to rate how likable and they sort of, in some negotiation, they sort of got some outcome. And then they were told afterwards what the true state of the world is. And then they rated again how likable their counterpart was. And you can see this live commission, that is an active misstatement, yields great economic outcomes. And people, if they believe it, it works great. But once they learn the truth, they feel really misled, and they, you can take a huge hit once the truth comes out. And it's very different for this, for deflection and paltering, where both of those don't take quite the economic hit. Sorry, quite the hit to likability. Okay, let me sort of close with one other idea. This is some work in progress, and so I would welcome feedback on this. This is work with Polly King, where we're working to think about how we evaluate deceptive acts. And in thinking about the belief speaking, it's easy to focus on statements where a lot of the early definitions have lived. And then Benny was also talking about actions, and then I think with the sort of the revised definitions, also thinking about emotions. And Polly King and I've been working on some work on misrepresenting emotions, building on some earlier work by Ingrid Fulmer and Bruce Berry. And we've begun to think about, through this work, how do we perceive the ethicality of deception? And we've begun to think about the sort of the magnitude of the lie. That is, how different is this lie from the true state of the world? What are the intentions? Was the intent to mislead people? What are the consequences of that deceptive act? And what are the norms in this setting? I think, that it's actually, as I've been hearing more about sort of Benny's work and Taya's work and Emma's work, realizing that a lot of these ideas have a lot of overlap with some of the concepts that others have been working on. But here, yeah, we've developed this framework for thinking about how we evaluate deceptive acts along different dimensions. All right, I'll end there. And I don't think we're taking questions now. We'll sort of keep going, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that was great. Yeah, I think we'll transition. And Maurice and everyone else, while we do these transitions, there's a few really great comments in the chat that I think can set the stage for discussion later, and feel free others to contribute as we kind of go from panelist to panelist. Sorry, Benny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, Daniel's next if you're ready. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to the symposium. I'm Daniel Effron. And I've been asked to talk about honesty as truth-seeking, right? So honesty is, as Benny mentioned, isn't just about telling the truth. It's about seeking out accurate information. And truth-seeking is particularly important in our information-rich environment. We're in this remarkable time in human history where we have instantaneous access to so much information. But we're also surrounded by misinformation. We're surrounded by fake news and alternative facts. And this means that we can't believe everything we read online or everything that we hear from authorities or friends. And because we're in a misinformation-rich environment, it becomes difficult to engage in truth-seeking for a couple of reasons. The most straightforward one is that sometimes people encounter misinformation and they don't know it's false. It's tough to distinguish between fact and fiction. But as someone that studies moral psychology, I'm interested in a different barrier that I think has received less attention, which is that sometimes people encounter misinformation and they know it's false and they don't care. That is, sometimes they think it's morally acceptable for others to spread misinformation. And if you encounter a piece of misinformation and you think, well, that's fine, even though I know it's false, you're probably less likely to engage in more truth-seeking, right, to figure out what's actually true if the piece of information you're seeing is false. You're probably less likely to speak up. If you're online, you're less likely to post a comment or a correction, which interferes with others' truth-seeking. And you're probably more likely to amplify the misinformation too, which sort of bleeds into some of the other violations of honesty besides truth-seeking, but which interferes with others' attempts to seek truth. You're contributing to this misinformation-rich environment. So over the past couple of years, I've been doing a line of work on what I call the moral psychology of misinformation. My argument is that if we want to understand why misinformation spreads and what we can do about it, we need to focus not just on why people believe this stuff, but why they sometimes think it's perfectly okay, even though they don't believe it. So here are a few headline findings from this line of work. So what makes misinformation seem morally acceptable, even when people are highly aware that it's false? Well, a really straightforward variable is motivation. So in study after study, when I expose people to fake news articles that are clearly identified as false, or false claims from political figures that are clearly identified as false, people tell me they don't believe this stuff, but they're less troubled by it if it aligns with their politics than if it doesn't. Right? People think blatant lies are less problematic if the lies fit with beliefs that they hold dear than if they don't. Very straightforward. A little bit less straightforward is a second variable that's popped up a bunch, which is imagination. The idea here is that if I can imagine a lie being true, even though I know it's false, I'm more willing to give it a moral pass. I think it's less unethical for someone to tell that lie. And I've looked at this in a couple projects. So to introduce one, let me ask you to think back to 2016. So Trump's just been inaugurated. Sean Spicer, his press secretary, goes on TV and announces that the crowd was the biggest in history for any inauguration. And New York Times publishes side-by-side photographs of Obama's inauguration and Trump's and shows that this lie is actually a lie. No truth to it at all. And at some point, Spicer and other Trump administration officials stop defending the literal truth of the falsehood, and they start saying things like, well, the inauguration would have been bigger if the weather had been nicer, or it would have been bigger if security hadn't been so tight. And what they're inviting us to do is imagine that the lie could have been true if circumstances had been different. And in my experiments, I find this is a super effective strategy. It doesn't convince people that the lie is true. It just convinces them that it's not quite so unethical to tell, because they've been invited to use their imagination. And some more recent work with my PhD student, Beth Ann Helgeson, who I think is here today, we find that inviting people to imagine that a lie might become true at some point in the future also leads them to give the lie a moral pass. So in one experiment, for example, we find MBA students think it's less unethical to lie on a job application and claim that you have financial modeling skills if you invite them to imagine that maybe at some point in the future, they might be able to learn financial modeling. Okay? So it's still a blatant lie on the job application, but imagining how it might become true in the future seems to soften the moral blow. It doesn't seem quite as bad. So motivation and imagination can both make blatant misinformation seem more morally acceptable. A third variable I've looked at is repetition. It turns out that just hearing the same falsehood again and again and again, even if it doesn't make you believe it, it can make you feel like it's less unethical to tell. So in a series of experiments with Medaraj, we exposed people to a bunch of fake news articles that were clearly and unambiguously labeled as false. Some of them participants saw a bunch of times in the study. Some of them they saw just once. And it turns out that if they had seen the articles a bunch of times in the study, they thought they were less unethical to share online than if they were seeing them for the first time. Again, even though they didn't believe it. These moral judgments had downstream consequences too. When people thought that the fake news was less morally acceptable to share, they said they were more likely to share it themselves. They were less likely to censor people who spread this misinformation, and so forth. So a theme of this line of research is that it's surprisingly easy to make blatant misinformation seem a little bit more morally acceptable. And the concern here is that if you encounter misinformation and you know it's false, and you don't think it's all that morally wrong, why go to the effort to seek the truth? So what can we do about this? How can we encourage truth-seeking given these findings? So some preliminary work with Deborah Schulman suggests that if you just tell people that this misinformation is false, it's probably not going to be sufficient, right? Because the problem isn't that people always believe it. It's that sometimes they don't believe it and they don't care. So what we found some evidence of is that if you get people to think really carefully about why they think something might be ethical or unethical to spread, why a piece of misinformation might be ethical or unethical to spread, they say they're less likely to spread it themselves. And this effect seems to be mediated by them saying, oh, actually, yeah, it is pretty unethical to share misinformation. So again, these studies show that encouraging people to deliberate carefully about morality might undo some of these effects. So unfortunately, it's all too easy to reduce how much people care about misinformation. These preliminary studies suggest that encouraging careful thinking about morality may offer some protection. And ultimately, my goal is to improve understanding of the moral psychology of misinformation. And I hope that this will help people not only speak the truth, but also seek the truth. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That was interesting. There's a few questions in the chat as we turn it over to Julia and Juliana.
All right, guys, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Fabulous, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join. So the research I want to share with you deals with what I think is one of the sort of greatest challenges facing society today, namely how do people engage with sort of judgments and opinions that they don't agree with and even find sort of completely antithetical to their deepest held values. I have done this work for years and I've never really connected it to honesty, but then Taya convinced me that I'm wrong because of course, really understanding the world and having accurate beliefs demands that you understand what people who disagree with you believe. We have sort of a bunch of projects happening in parallel here, but today I want to focus on first sort of offering you a theoretical framework for understanding receptiveness to opposing views, and talking about it really sort of as a cognitive phenomena and how it fits into the prior literature. I will show you some recently published work on a self-report measure of receptiveness, And then once we kind of had a construct that we had defined and were able to measure, we were able to then also trace it behaviorally in conversation and examine the consequences of receptiveness for social interaction and conflict. So that's where I'm going to go towards the end of this very, very short talk. So when we first started thinking about receptiveness, we really use kind of classic theories in attitude formation and attitude change to think about what needs to happen for people to engage with information. And there's sort of a sequence of events that's supposed to happen, right? So first you have to be exposed to some piece of information. You then need to kind of consider it, right? Like noodle on it for a bit. And then you need to render an evaluation in terms of, is it good? Is it bad? Do I believe it? Do I not believe it? And there is a huge literature that can be sort of roughly arranged along these 3 stages of information processing that suggests that people are biased in favor of views that they agree with and against views they disagree with at every stage, right? So we seek out information that that supports our prior beliefs. We spend longer considering it. We give it greater attention. We remember it better. We then consider it to be more accurate, more truthful. We think the people who offer beliefs we agree with are sort of better, more moral, smarter people. And so thinking about attitude formation from this perspective led us to define receptiveness as the willingness to access, consider, and evaluate supporting and opposing views in a relatively impartial manner. So the idea here is that we think about that gap between how you treat views you agree with and views you disagree with across the entire kind of information processing continuum. And notice that we're not talking about people being like fully unbiased, because that almost never happens. We're talking about them being relatively impartial. When we started thinking about receptiveness in this manner and started trying to manipulate it, it turned out that it would be really useful to figure out if we're measuring it accurately. So this led to the development of a self-report scale that came out last year in management science. It's an 18-item scale. So here is sort of a very brief sample of 6 items, but it's 18 7 scale point items that essentially look at the extent to which you're curious about opposing views, the extent to which you experience negative affect when you're exposed to opposing views, and whether you stereotype people who disagree with you for essentially disagreeing with you. What we find is that in line with our theory, people who are higher on the scale engage in a lower level of selective exposure. They're better at maintaining attention to counter-attitudinal content, and they're less biased in how they evaluate evidence, confirming versus opposing their views. Importantly, we can show that receptiveness is stable over time and predict behavior outside of the lab. So, for example, we administered the scale to a large sample of registered voters right before the 2016 election. And then when we followed up with them at the time of the inauguration in January of 2017, we found that liberal voters who were more receptive were more willing to watch President Trump's inauguration, had more positive evaluations of it, and engaged with sort of a politically broader swath of news sources than liberal voters who were less receptive on our scale 3 months earlier. Okay, so we have this self-report measure, and we know that it predicts cognitive processing. The question is, how does this actually play out in social interaction? And so in order to pursue this question, we created an algorithmic measure of perceived receptiveness in language. So this is work with Mike Yeomans, who many of you know, Hannah Collins, Francis Chen, and Francesca Gino. And so essentially what we did is create an algorithm that picks out the cues in language that make counterparts believe that that the person who is speaking is really engaging with their perspective and thinking hard about what they have to offer. We find that perceptions of receptiveness increase willingness to engage in the future in these types of interactions, right? So increase your willingness to talk to this person you disagree with, work with them on a team. You evaluate this person more positively. The thing that's very interesting that we learned from the algorithm is that people systematically misperceive their own receptiveness. So when people think they're being receptive, what they're being is actually formal and polite, but it's not the same thing as actively engaging with somebody you disagree with. And to make all this sort of a little bit less abstract, here are some examples from our study. So this is text that people wrote in response to a question about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want you to read this and see whether you think this particular piece of text is receptive or whether this particular piece of text is receptive. So when I, normally do this in talks, there's like very, very high consensus about which one is which. And in fact, we totally cherry picked these because one of them is one of the most receptive pieces of text that we have in response to this question. And the other one is one of the least, but it's hard to put your finger on like what is doing the action, right? Like why does the second one feel so much less receptive than the first one? And so this is what the algorithm does, is it essentially highlights words and phrases that create that perception. So I understand is a signal of acknowledgement. I can also see is additional acknowledgement. Words like probably and possibly and sometimes are things we call hedges, right? So you're basically saying, I am not 100% accurate 100% of the time. And then I agree, right, is a signal of agreement. And then if you look at the unreceptive response, there's a lot of what we call negation. So things like do not and can't. And then my favorite feature of unreceptive language is explanatory language. So things like therefore and because. We as academics love these words, but they sound super condescending and conflict. Because we now have this algorithm, we can process large amounts of text very quickly. So this is data from Wikipedia talk pages, where Wikipedia editors argue about how to present contents in Wikipedia more accurately. And sometimes these talk pages erupt into personal attacks, which is a behavior that's punishable by Wikipedia. And so what we can show is we can take the threads from these discussions, put them through the algorithm, and based on the receptiveness of the first statement in the thread, predict how likely that thread is to erupt in a personal attack. And what we see here is that the receptiveness of the person who was attacked is actually a better predictor of the occurrence of the attack than the receptiveness of the attacker. So in other words, sometimes people say things that just, bring it on several rounds of conversation later. We can also train conversational receptiveness. So we can take the cues picked out by the algorithm and boil them down to sort of a very simple set of instructions that we've been calling the receptiveness recipe. In about 5 minutes, you can get people to write in a way that leads to perceptions of greater receptiveness, greater trustworthiness, sort of higher willingness to collaborate. And of course, this raises all sorts of really interesting questions with regard to truthfulness that I'm sure many of you are thinking about. If you're saying receptive words while not feeling very receptive, well, how receptive are you being? We've been thinking about that really in terms of want-should conflict, right? Most people don't want to be jerks, but it turns out they're not very good at it because we don't know the right words to use and our self-control fails. So we think of conversational receptiveness as a way to sort of allow your genuine self to shine through so that you can have more productive conversations. So in summary, we have a construct that we can measure. It predicts cognitive processing at the individual level. There seems to be some stability over time. And it has this interesting impact on social interaction where when people see you as being more receptive, it leads to better downstream consequences for conflict. Excited to hear all the questions. Thank you.
Juliana, we'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Okay, I just spilled water on my computer, so if something weird is happening, we're gonna blame it on that. Okay, so this session has been completely fascinating. Thank you for including me. I just think it's such an incredibly interesting topic. I'm in the fostering understanding section, but I think Julia did a really wonderful job on that. I think I'm really kind of I'm gonna go back a little bit to belief speaking and some of the stuff I'll share. So, you know, I'll start with this proposition that lots of you have already been thinking about, that there are a lot of social situations that we are in which honesty is very difficult. This happens all of the time, I think. So, you know, giving feedback to anyone, should I have told Maurice that he had, you know, spinach in his teeth while he was presenting? I would argue that even, I mean, some of the latest data that's come out on compliments, like even giving pro-social feedback, which you would think would be really easy and people obviously want this, I think there are some barriers to people feeling like they can do these things, like giving pro-social feedback, which, you know, is it really dishonesty, or is this more about, you know, disengagement or the ways in which you phrase things to people? Those are kind of questions we can discuss. And then kind of continuing on the theme that Julia was talking about, engaging with someone who disagrees with you. Should you do that? Should you tell a person why you think they are wrong in agonizing detail? Probably not. And I think if you kind of intuit your own responses in each of these cases, you might have a sense that you would probably want to avoid some of these situations. I think disengagement is a common instinct, and sometimes that can manifest as dishonesty. So why is it so difficult to be honest in these types of cases? And so, you know, I think that this comes down, I'm going to propose this comes down to this really, you know, fundamental aspect of social engagement, which is that we don't really know what other people are thinking. We don't know how they will react to our honest feedback or even our compliments, and we worry that they're just not going to like what we have to say, and all sorts of problems will occur. And I'm also going to argue that this is more in people's heads than maybe it is in reality. So I do have this paper that it's actually going to be under review in like 2 days. Now I'm super conscious about whether I'm being honest or dishonest in every single thing that I say here. But my favorite study in the entire paper is just this like pilot study, this pilot data that we collected, in which we had research assistants go out and collect survey data from respondents who are on campus. And as you can see from the images of these research assistants, all of them had something on their face. So it was either like a marker or like lipstick or a smear of chocolate. And the real dependent variable was just how many of the respondents that they stopped, these are just students around campus, and talked to, how many of them told them that they had something on their face. So, you know, kind of the most obvious sense of like feedback that would actually just allow them to fix the problem. And so out of the 212 people that they talked to, only 4 of them told those 4 research assistants. So, you know, just kind of highlighting how much people avoid actually providing feedback. I won't get into all the reasons that people gave, but to give you another example of this, we've done experiments where we've had people recall times when they gave or received feedback, or when they wanted feedback but they didn't get it, or they thought about giving feedback but they didn't actually give it. I won't go through all of the different descriptions here, but basically what we find when we ask about people's the givers' predictions about how much receivers wanted their feedback and receivers' actual reports about how much they wanted feedback is that there's this gap, this big gap that emerges. So you can just see between the blue and the white bars here that the receivers are saying that they really want the feedback. They have a strong desire for it, and the givers don't recognize that. So they're certainly mispredicting. They're underestimating how much the receivers want that, regardless of whether the feedback was actually given or not. Okay, and then the data on compliments are pretty interesting. So there are 2 papers that came out this year. It was a good year, I guess, to study compliments. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me that even with this like really pro-social feedback, it seems like people are hesitant to want to speak their beliefs here. So here's, a paper by Booth, B. and Bones in which they found that people actually reported feeling very positively when they got a compliment. They don't predict that a priori, the potential givers of the compliments, and they don't even recognize it after the interaction either. So there's not really learning either happening there. And here's another paper by Zhao and Epley, in which they looked at the predictions of awkwardness that would occur if they were to give a compliment, and they find that people expect there to be a lot more awkwardness than there actually is. And there's more so in the domain of compliments than in other types of social interactions. Okay, so what's the psychology that's going on here in these cases? So it's sort of 2 things. I think one is that people are underestimating how much others want and appreciate what could be considered pro-social gesture, maybe in the case of feedback if they're trying to help. And then the second thing is that people, I think, are overestimating the social awkwardness of what would happen if the gesture goes wrong in any sort of way. Okay, and then I also wanted to talk about some of the work on disagreements. So we run these experiments in which we force people to have disagreements. This is why all my participants and research assistants love to be part of my experiments. We were working with an organization called Bridge USA. They have centers in college campuses all across the country in which they have controversial conversations in which people disagree, and they kind of allow people to have this disagreement. And so we can go in there and run experiments with them. And what we've done is we make people disagree in different media. So we have them do it via video chat. So this is an actual still from an experiment we ran. We have them speak to one another. So we take out the video, we have them write to one another. And so one thing that's kind of interesting to think about with these different media, so they differ in many, many ways, but one way in which they differ is that they differ in the amount of sort of distance that people think they have from the conversation partner. So video chat and in person, of course, we've done those as well. That feels very close. That feels intimate. Whereas writing feels like something that has more distance, more emotional distance from it. And so what you see is that when you have people predict about what will happen if they have a 10-minute conversation with someone they disagree with, they think that well, first of all, that understanding will be pretty low. This is what happens when you actually have them do it. So there's just a main effect difference between predictions and actuals. They also predict that the understanding will be a little bit better in writing than in the other conditions. And in reality, of course, the reported understanding between the interactants is much lower in the writing condition than when they're video chatting or speaking. You also see this for conflict, that they predict there will be the least conflict when they write. So this is, again, they're sort of expecting that there's going to be this emotional distance that happens in writing. And in fact, the conflict that the pairs actually experience is the highest when they're writing to one another. And then when you ask them, which condition would you prefer to be in if you had a choice? Well, first of all, they would prefer not to do it at all. So they would much prefer to opt out. But if they have to do it and be in one of these conditions, they would prefer to be writing to one another. Okay, so kind of making the choice here that's most disengaged. This is actually a little bit complex because it's not necessarily clear that it's the condition that would elicit the most dishonesty, but it is the condition that would kind of be the most disengaging. That's the one that they would prefer to be in. And so, what's the psychology of what's going on here? So I'll borrow a great paper from Charlie Dorison and Julia and Todd Rogers. And what they found in this paper was that even having to just listen to someone that you disagree with, so a liberal having to listen to a very small clip of a Trump speech, people predict that will be a really bad experience. So this is the positive affect minus the negative affect on the y-axis here. And so you can see that in every single study, basically the forecasts, so the gray bars, people are predicting are going to be much more negative than what their actual experience is when they make them actually, listen to that clip. So people are thinking that the pain of disagreement will probably be more than it actually is. They didn't actually have them engage in this study, but I think that's kind of the psychology of what's happening. Okay, so let me just quickly wrap up. So of course, Emma and Taya have this great paper on already looking at people underestimating others' desire for honesty. Here, I kind of talked about it in the context of feedback and maybe even more pro-social gestures like compliments. I think that the psychology going on here is people are underestimating how much others will value this. They're overestimating the awkwardness of it, and then people might also tend to avoid disagreement too much, and when they do, they kind of do so unproductively in the written conversation, and that I think is kind of they're overestimating how painful it will be to disagree, which I think can track in interesting ways in terms of thinking about how people think about honesty too. Okay, so I will end there. Thank you all for your time, and I guess we now get into our conversation.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just briefly pull everything together. Thank you to all of our panelists, and then we'll head to the Q&A.
Great.
So like Maurice, I still have to check. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, I'll keep this quick so we can talk about all these interesting questions, but thank you to everyone for sharing all of your research with us. We hoped that by highlighting these different speakers today, we've encouraged you to think about honesty in a new way moving forward. Honesty has traditionally been seen often as belief speaking. So if we're curious of whether someone is honest, whether we're trying to judge them on honesty, we'll ask, does the person communicate what they believe to be true? If yes, we see them as honest. If no, if they communicate false beliefs, we see them as dishonest. So this sort of dichotomous categorization has been often used to speak about honesty. And what we hope to do today is show you that there's ways of engaging in belief speaking in between these two extremes. So Maurice highlighted some of this for us, but also that moving beyond belief speaking might be important to understand what it really means to be honest. So in our expanded view of honesty, we'd like to consider not only whether someone communicates what they believe to be true, but how they communicate these beliefs, if they make an effort to seek out information to form these beliefs, and if, when presented with counter evidence, are they willing to update their beliefs based on that evidence? And then lastly, are they making an attempt to foster understanding of those same beliefs in others? And we are showing these three factors as a Venn diagram because as of now, it's still an open question. We don't think one facet is necessarily more important than the other. So although belief speaking, again, has been traditionally a common way of talking about honesty, and as a sneak peek to the poll results, seems to be how a lot of you thought about honesty coming into this session as well, it's not clear that belief speaking is actually the most important way to view honesty. So that's still an open question. So in this model, which Taya, Emma, Benny, and Will, who are all here today, contributed to as well, honesty right now is framed as this overlap between the belief speaking, truth seeking, and fostering understanding components. But it's possible that what is viewed as honesty, one of these facets, two or three of these facets, is dependent on the setting or the situation. So that's something we hope to discuss with you all today. And we also hope to help you think more about what each of these individual facets mean. So when it comes to belief speaking, again, there's more than just saying false statements and full disclosures. So Maurice highlighted some more strategic forms of belief speaking, such as paltering and deflection. And I think paltering is also a really nice example of why these overlapping sections are important. So while paltering may fulfill belief speaking and honesty in terms of belief speaking, it's not necessarily fulfilling the fostering understanding component. So it's a behavior that may lead to belief speaking with a different understanding than all your true beliefs. So thinking about these in-betweens is important for considering what it means to be honest. It's also important to think about, again, how people are forming their beliefs to begin with. And we heard from Daniel about some barriers to truth seeking, such as motivated reasoning, imagining what could be true, and repeated encounters with information. And then even if someone forms their beliefs on facts, is willing to update their beliefs and speak their true beliefs, it's unclear if they're really honest if the recipient isn't walking away with those same beliefs. So we heard from both Julia and Juliana about some ways to try to foster understanding in others. A lot of honest conversations can be difficult or involve disagreement. So training receptiveness and trying to minimize disengagement might be ways to help foster understanding. And also, as Juliana just mentioned, recalibrating our expectations about how much people actually desire and appreciate honesty. So we think this model can be useful to promote discussion about what honesty means across different settings and situations. Again, it's an open question on whether all three facets are necessary to be honest at all times, and understanding that there are barriers and motives for being honest outside of belief speaking can help us navigate conflicts related to the different dimensions of honesty. We're hopeful that with this three-factor model, it will open up new avenues for encouraging honesty, both in individuals and at the interpersonal level, but also with leaders and organizations, which might not have been evident from a simpler characterization of honesty as belief speaking. And finally, we think that this model has the potential to create a more ethical culture of communication. So if honesty is just belief speaking, we're missing elements of that ethical culture of communication in knowledge and enhanced understanding, but this three-part model can add to that as well. So with that in mind, we're going to head to the Q&A, and we have some poll results from some of you here. So this is the poll you took at the beginning. The first question was the person who doesn't engage in truth seeking, doesn't verify their beliefs. And it looks like people still think this person is relatively honest. Likewise, someone who relies on wrong truth seeking or non-scientific evidence, relatively honest. When it comes to someone who is trying to hide a harmful finding, now we see some deductions in honesty. When it comes with someone misrepresenting their beliefs to improve understanding, so an example of not belief speaking, but actually perhaps trying to foster understanding, again, not as honest. And when it comes to the protection scenario, moderately honest overall, even though you might imagine that 3 and 5 would be quite similar since both involve hiding information. So this is what you answered entering into the session. We are curious to see if those results have changed. So I'm going to switch to gallery view so we can talk about these results and engage in discussion overall. Feel free to type in the chat, and we will, Benny, Taya, Emma, and I will be moderating the chat, or you can raise your hand and speak up as well.
There's some great questions, conversation in the chat. We have 25 minutes. We'll go to 11:30, and we can stay a little after. We'll definitely save the chat. So I want to also say on behalf of everyone, thank you to the presenters. That was fascinating. I have learned a lot. I also love how you all weave together your findings without overloading us with statistics, but bringing out the main themes of your work. So I particularly appreciate that, because by having you all together, our hope and what I think we achieved was sort of bringing some of these ideas and some of the most central questions and insights from each of the programs of work together to bear on some of these big questions. I'm going to maybe turn over to Emma to see if you have any thoughts, because you, like the panelists, have been thinking a lot about honesty for many years now.
Sure. I mean, well, I love this session. I put a lot of my thoughts in the chat, and I want to allow kind of, people's interest to come about naturally. And I don't want to steer it too much, but as long as we have the poll results, like something that is just shocking in my mind from those results. And I'm curious to have someone who answered the questions, because the panelists weren't allowed to weigh in on this. But the finding that jumps out at me is that you all believe the most dishonest action was scenario 3, which was the scientist who discovers a finding that could do extensive social harm. Right. So imagine you find out that a marginalized group is intrinsically less intelligent or something than another group. And the scientist abandons this research. And this group of people thought that this was the most dishonest. And I mean, this is likely informed by my research on post-social lies, right? This I think is the most pro-social act of the ones presented, right? You don't want to harm a marginalized group, and that could have huge societal damages, but this seems to be very problematic with people. And so I'm just curious to hear someone weigh in on why they voted that way and how you think about this as it intersects with some of the other facets and scenarios.
So I think, well, depends obviously on the type of harm, right? So if you're saying, oh, I discovered something that could lead to even more bias, that's one thing. If you're thinking of, okay, I discovered something about radiation, for example, right? And then you abandon that research, potentially not a great idea. Or something that could lead to more, I don't know, political polarizing, but someone else could do it and then reframe it in a more harmful way. Right, like that seems bad. I don't know if this makes sense. You can, okay, sorry, let me try again. If you realize the harm of something, you might be able to at least describe it and, deal with it rather than leaving it out in the open where someone else will find it and potentially abuse it.
Got it. So maintaining control, basically, of information.
I think so, yes.
I don't remember all the questions, but it strikes me that if I remember them, that was more specific in defining context than the others. So for some of the others, I kept thinking, well, it depends on which situation I'm in or something like that. So you go back and take a look at the questions themselves, but that may be an explanation about how you've grounded that particular question relative to the others.
I almost have a question I want to throw back at you, which is that particular scenario struck me as being like very much pro-social line. Like, I think you have to say that withholding the findings is dishonest, but people might say, oh, but it could be the morally right thing to do. Like it's one of those things where it could seem morally right. So there's almost these two different dimensions there. But I'm curious if in any of your work you found that a pro-social lie is just seen as less of a lie, or if it's still just as much of a lie, but just a good one,
Yeah. I mean, so in most of my work, I haven't found that it's seen as less of a lie, but part of that is a function of the methods, right? Where controlling exactly the type of information that's misrepresented and just manipulating the consequences. But I think both of those things are true. I think a lot of these kind of intersections between these facets are likely seen as less dishonest, right? When you only violate one of the facets, right? Or you do it for a good reason. And I like your point about that we've thought about as a group a little bit, which is, right, dishonesty and morality might not always go hand in hand. And so I think this maybe speaks to Daniel's work as well, right? Which is, it seems like in the misinformation space, right, they're recognizing that this failure of truth seeking is a lie and, right, it is dishonest, but to the extent that it pursues some pro-social aim, whether to support our in-group or our beliefs, right, people think it's moral. And that adds, I think, another complication in just kind of this space in general and how to promote honesty if people don't even think honesty is what's right in the first place. I don't know if Daniel, you want to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, just empirically in these studies, people are telling us that they don't think that these lies are accurate at all. We have continuous ratings of accuracy, and people are like, "Nope, it's false. It is definitely a lie." But then their morality ratings are movable.
So, kind of stepping back maybe from the poll, and it's been a lot of information, but I'm curious a lot, especially from others in the audience for whom maybe this model, these ideas, thinking about things is new, or what your reactions are, kind of hearing these talks together in context. Julia mentioned that she hadn't thought about her work and kind of framed through honesty and sort of through conversations. I was like, well, everything you're studying sort of relates in different ways. That may be true for some of the other panelists and maybe for some of you in the audience. So yeah, I kind of want to open it up and maybe people who we haven't heard from or comments in the chat that would be good for discuss. Who'd like to start us off? Yeah, Ray, go ahead.
Yeah, let me first make sure I can be heard. Okay, great.
It's a little quiet, but we can, yeah.
Oh, let me.
I think that's okay, yeah.
Okay, so there's this distinction between overt lies and other ways that you create misunderstandings. And I think it's a great point, but then at the same time, I think there is still a real difference between overt lies and other forms of misrepresentation in the sense that you can train somebody, let's say MBA students, to dig deeper to, if there's someone's deflecting, you can teach them to like get back onto it. But if someone actually gives fake information, that is the one thing which takes away any control from the listener, because there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, if someone just flat out misrepresents facts, there's less agency on the other side's for the other side. But if there's, paltering, someone, at least you can imagine training an MBA student or any student in government to deal with it. There's nothing you can do to deal with a flat out lie.
Yeah, can I just sort of build on this? So one thing that I was thinking about through this panel was the shared responsibility that we have for being misled. So you can think about the deceiver and you can think about the target, and to what extent is the target responsible for being misled? And lies of commission may be very difficult to sort of share responsibility. That's really the deceiver. Some of these other acts where we're basically transferring some of that responsibility. And I think this is related to contextual factors. So when politicians are speaking or in a negotiation, maybe we think about more responsibility for the target to be more skeptical. So I think this idea of the shared responsibility for being misled is important.
So I think that's super interesting and something I've been thinking a lot about too, and I think relates to the question Juliana had in the chat too about kind of communicator target asymmetries. But I just wonder, is part of what I think adding the fostering understanding component, why it's useful is because it suggests, no, you as a communicator actually have to go beyond just belief speaking, right? I think it's, in my view, right, a mistake to give such a responsibility to the target to not be deceived. I think that's what we've been kind of doing in negotiations training and how the law treats it. But I wonder if that's fair, right? Even in your work, you find that targets dislike paltering a lot more than communicators do. I find similar things with omission. And so I just wonder, if there's a problem with that model of shared responsibility that we should be trying to solve, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think this is part of the chat too, that you can think about the communicator, the target, and an outside observer, where we have very different views of what's happening. And, I'm not sure that the deceiver or the target should be our gold standard. It should probably be the outside observer for like what's right. Who really is responsible here. But I think that framework is just right. I mean, that is, we often assign responsibility sort of too much, perhaps too quickly.
Why the outside observer, Maurice? I mean, it seems that the outside observer has less investment in the dialogue that's going on between sender and receiver. So why should that be the standard?
Well, my thinking is that these motivated beliefs to sort of foist responsibility, so shift responsibility to somebody else. I mean, so I was thinking about, paltering. When people say truthful things, they're misleading. And there we really found this chasm in perceptions where the person who was misled felt deeply misled, as if the deceiver was really, really deceptive. But the deceiver's like, look, I only said truthful statements. And they walk away with a totally different perception of whether deception had even happened. But I think outside observers would say, like, yeah, those statements, those truthful statements, they're really misleading. That in that case, they're more likely to come away and sort of side with the person who's deceived. And I think that helps us understand where the responsibility really should lie.
Will, go ahead, and then Nazla.
Yeah. So I was troubled a bit by Ray's challenge, I think, to the three-part model and to other ideas that, really there's a distinction with lies of commission, that you are defeating someone's agency. And all the other kinds of dishonesty are allowing agency as well, if I understood that correctly. And I think there were two tests of whether it's defeating someone's agency. And the first test was whether or not you can do something about it in the moment. And the other test was whether you could be trained in advance to do something about it. And I think one response that people have been discussing, which I think is really interesting, is whose responsibility is it? And I think that's definitely worth exploring. And that's one thing we've done for one reason why we've gone with this three-part response, but three-part framework. But I also was thinking that I'm not sure that the belief speaking section is the only one in which it defeats agency. I think the other two defeat agency just as well. So I think that when you don't try to find out whether your information is true, when you put no effort into that, you're doing just as much presenting of information that is, just flat out wrong. So you're doing just as much damage as when someone intentionally lies. So I think that one is also defeats agency. And I also think the belief, the fostering understanding does too. If you know that the other person is going to misunderstand what you say, then it defeats their agency just as well. So if you have power over whether or not they can misunderstand or understand what you say, you're defeating their agency just as well. So and then finally, the false information of a lie doesn't defeat agency perfectly. I mean, especially, you can just check out one of the things I love about smartphones is you don't have to debate anything anymore. You can just look it up, right? So in fact, when someone puts out false information out there are ways that you can be trained to do something about that as well. You can double check, you can check converging evidence and so on. So I think that in fact, the tripartite, that challenge that you presented is a really important challenge. And I think that the tripartite framework withstands that challenge. So thanks for the idea. It's really interesting.
Well, and Ray, you want to go ahead? Yeah. And then,
yeah. Well, let me just throw out one other twist. There's a category I don't think we've talked about, which is what if people are overtly untruthful with the expectation that the truth will be understood? And so, doing a lot of work in Asian cultures, I remember I was in Malaysia and I was, when I was after college and needed a favor to get a visa thing done and asked an official and he said, yes, I will do it. And I presumed that it would be done. And he presumed that it would understand that it would not be done. And so he was in fact telling an untruth, but fully expecting that I, as a competent listener, would figure that out and know the truth.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think that's well taken. And Ray, you probably better there, than any of us having your expertise in culture. I think in many cultures, there is this, the shared understanding. I know a lot of the students from India in my negotiation class say something similar where, well, I would say this and they would say this, but we would both know that, the truth is something different. And I think there's still so much we don't know about culture. I think Margarita had mentioned something in the chat about that. A big open question about honesty in different cultures. That could probably be its own set. Maybe next conference we'll dig into that one in its own panel session because we don't have, and the research that is there, having reviewed some of it recently, it's really mixed and not not clear from my view of it. But Nazla, you have a lot of expertise in that area as well, and I don't know what you want to weigh in on, but I'll turn the floor over to you.
I was just going to share anecdotally, as someone that has Indian in-laws, is that lack of a response also usually means no, but to maintain harmony, it's never said directly no. But anyways, I was actually going to go back to Emma's point about the potential issues with the shared understanding model. I think the nature of the interaction really matters there, right? I think in a competitive interaction like negotiation, I think we serve the target well by keeping them on their toes, right? Like to protect themselves from being the target of dishonesty. But if the goal of the interaction is to, I don't know, clear a shared misunderstanding between spouse or close friends, then I think we can shift that onus more to the not to the target, but to the person that is actually telling the lie or being honest.
Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
I just thought I'd throw something out there that sort of builds on something Maurice was saying and something Ray was saying. So, if paltering is about truthful but misleading statements, and Ray's talking about misleading statements that are expected to be understood as true, like it will be done when you really mean it won't be done. You say X, but you expect people to understand that you mean not X. There's also, I think, a class of deception that's it's sort of like what Ray's saying, but you can like distinguish between like the literal level of what someone's saying and like the general truth that they mean. So, the example that comes to mind is I live in the UK, and there's when we had Brexit, there was this bus driving around the UK that became really famous here. It said, vote for Brexit, stop sending £200 million a week to Brussels or whatever it was. It turns out this is not true. Like the UK was not sending that much money. But depending on how you do the accounting, there was a real number. It was something like, I don't know, let's say 20 million pounds. And there's a sense in which like the pro-Remainers who were saying, hey, it's not 200 million pounds, it's 25 million pounds. Like people who were pushing back against that said, well, look, the point is it's a big number, like 25 million, 200 million, it's all the same to me, it's a big number. So, the bus is saying something that is literally false, but, I kind of get the idea, right? And I think it's interesting to think about how people think about that class of dishonesty, where you're saying something that's literally false, but the general idea that you're meant to get across is assumed to be true. And how honest is that? Yeah, right, Taya, it's sort of about truthiness.
But that's I think interesting, because it also seems to depend on who the listener is, right? So the people who in your work, right, are motivated to agree with the general gist, right, think that's truthy enough in Taya's word, but other people find that really blatantly deceptive. And so again, it feels like it can be excused if we think some of the responsibility is in the listener, but otherwise, right, not as much.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like our latitude for acceptance of, how on target does the statement need to be? How literally true does it need to be for me to be okay with it? Depends on our motivation, among other things.
One thing that's interesting that I'm getting from the conversation, the chats and the talks is so much about, and Nazla's comment too, about the setting when we're talking about whose perspective and whose responsibility. And I really like the exchange a bit ago with Roy and Maurice. And but it's this theme that coming up. And even when I've presented some of my work and I've gotten questions sort of about this model, is like, is this a prescriptive model about like more like philosophy, like what should be considered honest as from some kind of philosophy, or is this descriptive? And then a lot of what we're talking about is what do we think is honest, and maybe there's not some objective third party observer, or maybe there is, but so much does seem to be what's the context, what is the perceiver's role in that context, and I think going back to the conflict kind of settings, especially that, for example, Julia and Juliana were studying, is sort of in those settings that it's not clear that people can come to agreement so easily, that there is one sort of shared understanding. I mean, I guess that's what makes those so challenging. So that does emerge to me as this big question of sort of whose perspective and whose responsibility. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how we grapple with that and labeling something as honest or less than honest. We have 2 minutes. I want to turn over to Benny and Elizabeth, who are have organized a fantastic session. So I want to thank you both, and maybe allow you to have the last words or last comments for today, and see what your thoughts are, kind of as you have listened in on all this and organized all this and presented.
Well, a final question, and then I'll give it to Benny, that I've been hoping to ask, because I think we've been really focused on the role of communicating beliefs and less so what we can do to make these conversations more effective moving forward, is I'm curious about Julia and Daniel's presentations, because something I took away from Daniel's presentation is that imagining what could be true might actually lead us to internalize false beliefs. But something that I took away from Julia's presentation is that imagining being open is part of what helps us engage in difficult conversations and perhaps instead update our beliefs. So I'm wondering if you two also see these as potentially leading to different results, or if there's ways we can encourage receptivity and avoid misinformation, or if you have any strategies or recommendations for us to think about moving forward with this.
It's a really, oh, go ahead, Julia, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no. I mean, this speaks to a few of the questions in the chat, right? And sort of this other like level that I don't think we've mentioned too much is sort of honesty with yourself, right? And this idea that when you're being sort of very argumentative and very confrontational, you are somehow expressing your most honest belief. And then when you're being more conversationally receptive and more conciliatory in your language, you're like toning it down for the sake of peace and harmony. But it's not clear, right? Because I can think of situations where I have sort of, you know, moderate, nuanced, complex beliefs, but confronting somebody on the opposite side of, you know, whatever perceived divide exists makes me actually dig in and become more extreme in that moment. So what is my own true accurate level of conviction, I think is sort of unclear, right? So sort of as an example to like make it all more real, I have a relative who doesn't want to get the COVID vaccine, right? And so like, I understand that the science is new, and I understand that people can have real objections, and, you know, Johnson and Johnson just came out with like yet another warning. But when I'm talking to this person, I am, you know, 100% convinced in that moment that no reasonable person could possibly ever for any reason not get vaccinated. And it's a little bit like the research on empathy gaps, right? It's sort of which mental state is my like real mental state, which I think is a very, you know, so it's not like an answer, it's just a whole bunch of new questions that I'm throwing back at you. But this is what it made me think about.
Exposure to, moral outrage at misinformation can be useful or not useful depending on who you're talking to. So the kind of misinformation that people are exposed to most frequently is misinformation from their own tribe, and that's kind of the context I had in mind when I ran these studies. And I think in that case, when you encounter misinformation, like from a societal standpoint, we want people to say, look, I may agree with you on principle, but you can't be spreading misinformation. I want to call you on that. I want to, post a correction or block you or unfollow you or whatever. But moral outrage at misinformation may be less useful when we're talking to people from another tribe, right? Moral outrage stops us from engaging with people, and those are the contexts where maybe it's okay that imagining how something could be true lessens moral outrage. The problem is, in our studies, we find that these imagination effects only work for misinformation that's aligned with your politics, right? So you're more willing to excuse falsehoods that you like if you imagine they could have been true. that's, I think, not such a good thing. And you're not more willing to excuse falsehoods that you don't like if you imagine how they could have been true. So I think in practice, this doesn't actually facilitate intertribal discussions. So that's kind of too bad.
Well, thank you all. I mean, we're over. The only thought I wanted to share, and of course we can stay longer and talk about this if anyone are interested, is the importance of different facets. So like Elizabeth pointed on, we often give like belief speaking the due diligence because that is what we often default to when we think about what is honest, right? Saying what someone believes to be true. But of course, like the thing that was interesting for me, and it was part of our discussions, was the changes in the dominance of certain facets as we go across different situations. There's a lot of complexity there that I'm not sure if anyone has any, like there's baseline evaluations of which is more important, or situations in which you think maybe some facets would be less important. And if anyone has any.
Yeah, so maybe just in the interest of time and respect for people's busy day today, we can close it out. We'll save the chat. We have it recorded. And I think the procedure, I'm not sure if people, I think who have registered for the conference will be able to view it at some point. This is what we did last year, as opposed to public. And I personally very much look forward to continuing these conversations offline, online, upcoming conferences. I think some of you will be at Academy of Management, where there's some similar sessions with some of this group. I think all of you in this room are doing really fascinating work in this area, and or thinking about doing interesting work in this area if you're doing work in other areas. And thank you, everyone. And we will see you throughout the conference.
Great panel, everybody.
Really interesting.
Thank you.
Well done.
Good job, Benny and Elizabeth.
Hey.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great job
yeah, nice
organizing.
job
Yeah,
organizing
that was
this.
great. Really
It was
interesting.
really,
Elizabeth.
I wish we could
Fun.
keep talking.
It was really great.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, and I just so appreciate, and thank you, Maurice, for your talk. I think it's so interesting as I've reflected on the last year. I don't know if I've had a chance to tell you this about, you have all these different papers sort of over the past few years, especially, but really longer. And it's been interesting for all of us to kind of step back, view them holistically as we've been trying to synthesize and organize all of what we know. And I don't know if you've sort of had these thoughts of as you've been developing this line of work over many years, but it's interesting putting these pieces together and then thinking of them through this new lens. So and that table you have is sort of informative to this part of it. So I wanted to.
Can I just share my screen really quickly?
Yeah, sure.
I just got an email like 20,
I don't know if you have screen sharing.
1 minute ago. Oh, I don't have screen share.
Let me try to give that.
Because I just got an email 1 minute ago with a document from our research coordinator on this honesty project, and I wanted to. Let's see if I can do it. No, I can't.
No, I don't think so. You'll have to do it offline.
Yeah, but anyway, it's our list of. It's got white lie, declining to respond, paltering, dodging, deflection, honesty, soft truth, and equivocating, and brutal honesty. So we've taken your list and added about 3 or 4 categories to it.
That's so good.
That's what we're doing right now. I just thought it was cool timing that we got this. I got this email like 1 minute ago.
That's so fun. Yeah. Well, I guess, sort of, Taya, like it's, I wish I could say I had a sort of a deliberate trajectory here, but as Emma
none
knows
of us do, but I say
well,
from the outside observer.
Well, it feels deliberate. I mean, you're the father of the honesty.
The father of honesty. That's big shoes to fill.
No.
Maurice Schweitzer, father of honesty.
No.
You're Elizabeth's grandfather of honesty.
No. I feel like I had the privilege of getting to work with Emma.
Yeah.
And then
as do we.
It is a big privilege.
Right. And then it just started happening. Yeah. Oh, so fun. So great to see all of you. Elizabeth, so good to meet you.
Yeah, finally, right? We've been trying to do this.
I know.
We'll come to her talk tomorrow.
All right.
Here's some more.
Is it going to be good?
I'm gonna try.
It's gonna be great.
I think it will be great too.
It'll be great. All right.
All right,
Good to
see you,
see
Maurice.
Thank you for participating. I'm really glad we did.
It was so fun.
Yeah, and share with us your forthcoming work, the emotional deception and anything else relevant. Just send it our way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the paper you have with Sam that he presented, I don't know what stage that's in on the deception paradigms and how basically the participants are all pretty suspicious.
Great?
Yeah, that's.
Oh my God, it's so great. Yeah, Sam is, he just wants to, he's like a perfectionist. I'm like, you have more than enough for a paper. He's like, yeah, but I haven't pinned down, like the whole treatise. I'm like, yeah, it's okay. But yeah, it's so he's run so many studies. And looking at these paradigms, and I mean, basically all of the basic paradigms are so transparent and in some sense sort of insulting. Like when I tell you, like, go take a coin, flip it 10 times and tell me how many heads you got. And it's like, why are we doing that? And then we're saying like, well, it's just like filling out an expense report or filling out your taxes. Like, no. Like when you fill out an expense report, it's to get reimbursed. Like that's the whole point of it. It isn't to transparently see whether or not you're going to lie to me.
Yeah. And what's interesting is we've held these as sort of better than just a simple, very straightforward self-report measure, which people also know exactly what you're asking, like how often do you lie or something. And but because it's behavioral and we tend to give it more weight, but they're probably similar in that people know what's going on and it captures some information. I mean, I still think even if people know what's going on, it can capture information, but maybe not any better necessarily than simple self-reports that are more obvious. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So I missed the talk, although I did see his poster on it, and I am going to his talk tomorrow. But doesn't the fact that people know it's measuring lying make it more persuasive that, like, right, whether you're willing to incur the basically emotional cost of doing so?
Yeah, but it's a different psychology. So the psychology of people cheating on an expense report or an insurance claim is different than the psychology of here's a very transparent, I know you're measuring my honesty, because now demand effects, there's a relationship with the experimenter that becomes very important. So I think that the experimenter wants and expects deception. And so, for example, one of his studies was like, if it's observed versus unobserved, what happens? And I think it's just I think it's a different psychological process. And in some cases, I think people are even more honest. So it's like what happens is like, okay, you're measuring my honesty. Well, if this is about a measure of my honesty, then I want to show you I'm really honest.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had trouble because to me, it's clearly an incredibly artificial situation. I mean, it's not only that, but it's you're given this, like, okay, I'm gonna play a game with you. The relationship between the experimenter and the subject becomes the primary thing going on here.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, and so then it's like, oh, so game rules are applying now. But then you're trying to find out if I'm honest. So it's a game about whether I'm going to show you I'm honest or not. And then, you're lost. You're completely lost now from true reality about whether you're going to be honest to your mom who just cooked you dinner that tastes terrible or something like that. It's just a totally different situation.
That's right. So when you're lying to your mom, there's a very different social relationship. There's a very different purpose of the lie, as opposed to, I mean, it's like practically insulting, particularly like the observable ones. Like, I'm going to roll a coin on the screen and then you're going to tell me if it's heads or tails. Like, like what kind of relationship do we have with the participant when we're saying, here's how I'm spending your time? I
think that the Batson's hypocrisy study might get around this. It'd be interesting to know if your colleague did that study, because in that one, it's like you get to decide who gets to do this unpleasant task. Some people like to flip a coin to make it fair. That's up to you whether you do that or not. So they're not forcing the subject to flip this coin. They're not creating this artificial situation. They gave a good rationale for why you might want to flip that coin. So when he finds that, 90% of the people who flip the coin end up getting the better task, that's pretty good sign of actual incentivized honesty where there's no artificiality to it. It'd be nice to see if your student, your colleague, did it with that paradigm.
That's an interesting idea. That's an interesting idea.
Because to me, that one doesn't seem so artificial with that's in mind.
Yeah, and some of the expense reports can be less. I mean, one of the ways in an older study, we did the expense report, like they did a task and then they actually physically did fill out a report. And so it's, it's a little more removed, there's different variations, but I think the ones where it's on the screen online and it's the coin flipping and it does feel game-like. And that's what sort of my recent work has been focused on. Like when people feel like it's a game, there's a whole different set of standards and norms.
These like rules. Yeah, these like rules.
Different rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a game.
Yeah.
In any case, okay,
Good.
well, I guess we should probably
Bye,
call it, and
See you
we'll
guys.
see you guys throughout the conference. Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bye.
hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.